The twin suns of Xiphon 9 burned low in the sky, casting a dull orange haze over the sprawling, lawless trade port known as the Wastes. Beneath the rusted bones of forgotten freighters and corroded towers, the black market slithered like a wound no one wanted to heal. Here, anything could be sold, and everything had a price. Weapons, technology, flesh. In the back row of the farthest stall, beneath a torn canopy and beside a leaking coolant tank, stood a narrow cage with its energy barrier flickering dimly. No trader boasted about the occupant. No display readout advertised her traits. There was no line of curious buyers or wide-eyed children marveling at her alienness. Just dust, just silence. Inside that cage, motionless and unblinking, sat a being that glowed faintly even in the gloom. She was tall by human standards, but folded inward, like she wished she could disappear. Her skin shimmered with the deep gradient of interstellar light, blues fading into violets, shot through with veins of pulsing white, like stars collapsing beneath her surface. Her hair hung like molten metal, draped across one shoulder, tangled and dirty. Her eyes, though mostly hidden, flashed briefly when movement passed too close, not out of curiosity, out of caution. Her name had been stripped from her. The tag on her cage read only, Lot 927, Biolume class, sentient unverified, no bids. She had been passed between traders for nearly 2 planetary cycles now, each one lowering her price, growing more disinterested, more resentful of her silence. She did not speak, she did not obey, she did not entertain, and so her value had collapsed to nothing. In this place, being beautiful meant nothing without purpose, without spectacle. She was too proud to beg, too strange to understand, and too stubborn to break. Now, she was merely a fixture of the stall. Furniture. Something to ignore unless she caused trouble, which she never did. Today was no different, until a man stopped. He was human, maybe late 30s, tall, lean, and layered in the weathered garb of someone who'd traveled too many miles on foot. His boots were coated in Xiphon dust, his eyes half-lidded with fatigue, and a holopad blinked softly from the strap across his chest. He didn't glance at the weapons booths or the exotic food stalls or the glowing alleys where synthetic companions waited for purchase. He walked straight to her cage and paused. And looked, really looked, not at her glow or her curves or the shimmer of her alien skin. He looked at her posture, her stillness, her silence, and something shifted behind his eyes. "Who is she?" the man asked, his voice gravel thick and disinterested. The trader barely looked up from his seat, a squat man with silver implants running down the side of his neck and a bottle of blue liquor clenched in one fist. "Bah, you don't want that one." He waved lazily at the cage. "Pretty sure. But she's defective. Doesn't talk, doesn't respond to stimuli, no tricks, can't fight, can't breed, might not even be fully sentient." The man said nothing. She was part of a cargo haul 2 traders ago. No registry, no papers. Some kind of bioluminescent offshoot from a collapsed colony on the fringe. They gave her to me in a package deal with a case of acid rifles. The trader laughed dryly. Honestly, the rifles were more polite. The man took a step closer to the cage. The alien woman, Lot 927, shifted ever so slightly. A flicker of light passed through her, so brief it might have been imagined. Her gaze met his for the first time, and for a breath, he forgot what air was. There was no plea in her eyes, no invitation, only resilience, quiet, unbending resilience. "I'll take her," the man said simply. The trader stared. "What, for real? How much?" The man's voice was steady, flat, the kind that didn't haggle. The trader blinked. "You can have her for 50 credits. Hell, 20. Just get her off my hands before she dies and stinks up the place." The man reached into his coat and tossed a small, worn credit chip onto the table. "Done." The trader grunted, thumbed the chip, and pressed the release on the cage with a yawn. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The barrier sputtered and dissolved. The woman didn't move. She stared at the human in front of her, as if trying to discern whether this was just another trade, another hand to be passed to. He knelt. He didn't reach for her. He didn't demand. He just said softly, "You're not property. You never were. But if you come with me, you won't be forgotten." The cage flickered behind her. She stood slowly, uncertain. The man stepped back. And then, for the first time in 2 years, Lot 927 took a single step toward the light. She hadn't spoken by the time they reached the docking bay. Not a word, not a sound. Her gait was strange, graceful in a way that didn't seem practiced, like a creature relearning how to carry itself without the weight of a cage. Her steps were too light for a being of her height, and the long strands of her bioluminescent hair seemed to float rather than fall, responding to unseen rhythms in the air. He watched her without making her feel watched. That was a trick he'd learned in fieldwork: observation without intrusion. Let them breathe, let them choose. She didn't run, that was something. His ship, the Orpheus, was older than he liked to admit. Once a survey vessel, now stripped down and repurposed for his independent research runs. There was nothing luxurious about it, no polished chrome or climate-controlled lounges, but it was safe, quiet, his. He ushered her in, not with a touch but with a simple nod. She stepped over the threshold like someone crossing dimensions. Her gaze roamed the interior, landing on the bulkhead vines he'd planted for oxygen recycling, the walls scrawled with star maps and geological samples. Her eyes rested longest on the single seat beside his in the cockpit, unoccupied, unworn. He powered up the engines, setting course for the orbital outpost where he stored most of his data. They'd be in the void for a few hours. Alone. "I'm called Ren," he said at last, not looking at her. "Just Ren. You don't owe me anything." She sat across from him, arms wrapped lightly around her knees, eyes like galaxies held in fragile glass. Her head tilted slightly. A flicker of light passed through her skin, faint, a ripple of violet across her collarbone. "I didn't buy you," he added. "I paid to make sure no one else could." That flicker again, not brightness, resonance. He reached slowly to the console, activating the food synthesizer. A faint chime, a soft release of steam, nutrient stew. She didn't recoil from it. Instead, she approached, stood for a long moment, then took the bowl in both hands. She ate with precision, quietly. No mess, no greed. He watched. And then, just as he turned back to the nav screen, he heard it. A sound. Not words, not quite, but not just a tone either. A melodic hum, subtle and deliberate. Her voice, the first sound she'd made. He looked at her. She had paused, bowl still in hand, her eyes locked with his. The hum had been a test, a thread. Ren smiled softly. "I hear you." Her shoulders loosened, the light in her skin softened. It wasn't trust yet, but it was beginning. Ren didn't ask her name that night. He didn't push her. He knew what it meant to lose language, not the ability to speak, but the will to be heard. That loss never came all at once. It was peeled away over time, with each insult, each act of ownership, until silence became safer than identity. So he let her move at her own pace. She explored the ship slowly, touched nothing, not out of fear, out of respect. He noticed how she stopped by the viewport and stood there for hours, watching the stars, tracing unseen constellations with her eyes. Her skin glowed differently in open space, more vibrant. Not brighter, but richer. Like the light outside remembered her. She didn't sleep that night, but she rested, curled in the seat beside his in the cockpit. Her head tilted toward the hum of the engines like it soothed her. He spoke softly as he worked, told her about his expeditions, about the moons of Valora, where the ice sang when fractured, about the ruins on Delta Lern, where vines grew through stone like veins. She didn't answer, but she listened. By the second rotation, she began mimicking the sounds of the ship, low chimes, engine harmonics, even the static echo of the old radio signal he sometimes let run in the background. She responded not in words but in resonance. It was language, just not his. That evening, as they approached the orbital station, she stood by the console and pressed her palm to the surface. A glow pulsed outward from her skin, soft and warm. Her eyes met his. He heard it, not in his ears, in his mind. A name, not a sound but a shape, a vibration that formed syllables from memory. "Kelia." He whispered it aloud. "Kelia." She smiled for the first time, not wide, not grand, but real. He smiled back. "You're not a lot number, Kelia, not a specimen, not an accident." Her hand remained on the console. The light in her body hummed like music beneath her skin. "You were never worthless," he said. And this time she didn't hum. She nodded. And in that one small movement, Ren knew he hadn't just rescued her. He had set something free, something ancient, something that had waited far too long to be seen. The outpost orbiting Alaris Prime was little more than a salvaged ring of metal and old ambition. Ren docked the Orpheus with practiced ease, guiding the ship into a private berth lined with flickering security lights and faded banners from the Terran Expansion League. Few inhabited this place now. Only fringe researchers, cargo crews, and those who preferred the shadows to the stars. Kelia followed him silently down the ramp, her bare feet making no sound on the cold steel floor. She wore a cloak Ren had given her, more to shield her from curious eyes than temperature. It concealed the glow of her skin, but not her presence. People still turned to look, not out of recognition, but awe. She moved like gravity bent differently around her. Ren led her to the central archives, where he had access to linguistic software and deeper research tools. The attendants knew him well enough to wave him through without question, though their eyes lingered on Kelia with uneasy fascination. Inside the chamber, he motioned for her to sit near the console. She did, eyes sweeping over the floating holoscreens and diagnostic streams that danced through the air like smoke. Ren opened a new session and turned on the adaptive translation interface. "I want to understand you," he said gently. "Not just your words, your language, your memory." She blinked slowly. Then, without speaking, she placed her palm on the console again. This time, the light she released was deliberate. A pulse. A sequence. The interface stuttered. Then it began to display symbols, complex, elegant, organic shapes that grew like roots across the screen. "Not a spoken tongue," Ren murmured. "Not even sonic. Your people communicate in photonic harmonics." She tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "You knew I'd figure that out." The symbols kept forming, language drawn not in grammar but in emotion, tone, memory. He stared as the interface tried and failed to translate it into Terran equivalents. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his chest. The tether flared, and in that moment, he saw it. Not images, not facts, but her truth. A planet with crystalline trees that sang during eclipses. A people who built knowledge into their very bones, each generation born with the memory of the one before. And then the breaking. Fire from above. Lights that didn't sing but screamed. Chains, barriers, silence. She had not been discarded for being worthless. She had been silenced for being dangerous. Not through force, but through the terrible act of being ignored. When the vision faded, Ren staggered back. Kelia caught his hand before he could fall, anchoring him not with strength but presence. "You remember everything," he whispered. "Even the pain." She nodded. He looked into her eyes, saw not fragility but resilience sharpened to something sacred. "I'm not just going to learn your language," he said. "I'm going to help you teach it. Speak again." She didn't smile this time, she glowed. It didn't take long for word to spread. Somehow, someone at the outpost had leaked the data burst. Perhaps they hadn't understood what they'd seen. Maybe it had just looked like a pretty pattern of lights, a harmless curiosity. But it reached the wrong ears, and the wrong man came looking. Ren knew the moment the alert came through his datapad. Unregistered ship. Black hull. Ident code falsified, but not well enough. It was Jarnak, the trader who had sold Kelia for the price of a broken drone. He arrived under the guise of routine docking, his ship parked 2 bays down from the Orpheus. But Ren saw the mercenaries that flanked him. Not subtle, not clean. Jarnak didn't care for subtlety. He wore his cruelty like jewelry, cybernetic teeth, etched implants running across his face like veins of mercury, and an ego too loud to fit inside his own skull. Ren found him waiting in the lounge outside the archive hub, leaning back in a chair that hissed under his weight. "You always had a soft spot for lost things," Jarnak said, raising a glass. "But I didn't think even you would bother nursing that broken lamp back to life." Ren didn't answer. His fingers flexed at his side. "You gave me 20 credits for her," Jarnak said with a grin. "You know what she's worth now? With those lights? With that mind? Hell, I could auction her off in the core worlds and retire." Ren stepped closer. "She's not yours." "Everything's for sale out here, Ren. You just forgot how the game's played." "I haven't forgotten," Ren said, his voice low. "I just stopped playing with trash." Jarnak's smile faltered. "You don't scare me," Ren added, "but you should be scared of her. She doesn't speak. She doesn't fight." Ren leaned in. "She remembers." Jarnak's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll take her memory out piece by piece." A hum built behind them, soft, rising. The lights in the hall shifted, turned violet blue. Jarnak turned just as Kelia stepped into view. She wore no cloak now. Her skin pulsed with rhythmic light, her eyes fixed on Jarnak, not with fear, with authority. She lifted her hand. The tether between her and Ren flared, and Jarnak, brash, cruel, certain, stumbled back as a wave of harmonic force slammed into his mind. He dropped to his knees, howling. Ren stepped beside her, calm. "She doesn't scream," he said. Kelia spoke at last, voice soft and resonant. "She sings." And the corridor filled with light. The mercenaries fled. Not with pride or strategy, but in blind, tripping panic as the harmonic waves surged through the corridor behind them. Kelia had not moved again. Her voice, no louder than a breath, still echoed through the steel bones of the outpost, coiled in the air like scentless fire. Ren had seen war before, seen weapons detonate and soldiers scream, but never had he seen silence wielded as violence. Jarnak didn't rise. He remained hunched, hands over his ears, face wet with the tears of those who realized too late that they misunderstood everything. He whimpered nonsense into the floor, as if trying to call back the twisted power he thought he held over her. Kelia watched him, without malice. Only clarity. She turned and walked away. Not to flee. There was no fear in her gait now, but because he no longer mattered. Ren followed her, the back of his neck still tingling from the residue of her voice. He didn't speak until they were inside the Orpheus again, the doors sealed behind them. Her glow had dimmed to its usual soft rhythm, but her chest still rose with deeper breath, her body realigning itself after release. He placed a hand gently on the edge of the table where she stood. "You didn't hurt him," Ren said. "Not really." Her voice came, steadier now. "He is not worth the memory it would cost me." He felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. "Kelia," he said slowly, "when they took you, when they sold you, did you ever believe it would end?" She turned to him. Her eyes held stars, not metaphors, stars, remnants of places no longer on any map, suns that had died before humanity ever learned to look up. "No," she said. "I thought my voice was a gift that turned into a curse, and then you heard me, and did not flinch." Ren looked at her, absorbing the truth he had always felt but never fully held. "I didn't rescue you." "No," she agreed. "You believed I didn't need rescuing." She stepped closer to him now, so near he could see the fractal lines of light tracing through her skin. "You gave me what they never could," he asked. "What's that?" Her voice was softer than ever. Reflection. He felt his throat tighten. He nodded, just once. From the overhead, the alert light blinked, soft and blue. A transmission from the outer system. Ren opened the line. "Dr. Grayson," a crisp voice greeted him. "We received your data packet regarding the alien harmonic linguistics. The council is intrigued. They're requesting a presentation, in person." Ren looked to Kelia. She was already nodding. "I will speak," she said. Ren leaned into the console. "We'll come." The central chamber of the Terran Linguistic Authority was carved into the belly of the orbital station Veritas, a cold, bright place where knowledge was judged before it was honored. 12 members sat in a crescent arc, robes ceremonial, their faces half-shielded by gold-trimmed veils that marked status above function. Ren stood beside Kelia, who wore nothing but her presence. Her glow was not muted, not hidden. The chamber quieted the moment she entered. Ren could feel it. The unease. The discomfort of those who had never stood beside something more beautiful than they could name. A gray-bearded man at the center cleared his throat. "This is the entity listed in your report as subject Kelia?" Ren didn't hide his distaste for the term. "Her name is Kelia, and she is not a subject." One of the councilwomen leaned forward. "We received your transmission, the harmonic symbols, the wave signatures. They're fascinating, but without a means of replication, how can we consider this a communicable language?" Kelia stepped forward before Ren could respond. She looked at each of them, not with defiance, but the calm patience of someone who had spent lifetimes being doubted. Then she began to speak, not in Terran, in light. Pulses emanated from her skin, sharp, rhythmic, vibrant. They danced across the floor, up the walls, weaving into shapes and colors, memories and meanings. The chamber lights dimmed in reverence, whether from design or awe. Ren didn't know. She sang her birth, she sang the fall of her city, she sang the cage, and then she sang Ren. Not his name. His truth, his pain, his curiosity, his defiance, his stubborn, quiet belief that even something deemed worthless could still reshape the stars. When it ended, the chamber was silent. The council didn't know what to say. The gray-bearded man finally stood. "What she speaks is not language." Ren stepped forward, fists clenched. It's communication, it's cognition, it's memory. It's art, someone else muttered. At best. Kalia said nothing. She simply turned and walked back to Ren's side. One of the younger members, silent until now, rose at the far end of the table. I understood her, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how, but I did. Eyes turned to her. I heard what she meant, not just what she said. She doesn't need our approval. Kelia's glow pulsed once, bright whole. Ren smiled. No, she doesn't. They left the council chamber without bowing. Behind them no verdict was passed, but none was needed. The universe had already begun to listen. The return from Veritas was not a retreat. Ren knew that in every breath. They hadn't won the council's approval, not unanimously, not officially, but they had left something behind, something more lasting than sanction. A fracture, a question, a memory of light. One young scholar had risen in their defense, and others would follow. Not all at once, but slowly, like the first cracks before dawn. Kelia stood by the Orpheus's main viewport as stars glided past, her reflection layered with motion. She had not dimmed since leaving the council chambers. If anything, she burned brighter now, her skin alive with shifting hues of lavender and ice blue, the light inside her no longer a guarded flame, but an open fire. She turned to Ren, and he could see it in her expression. Something new. Not just safety, belonging. I thought they'd silence me again, she said, the Terran words thick with accent, but beautiful in their own right. But I was louder than I feared, he nodded. Because you remembered who you are. She came closer. Not out of need, but choice. Every step a declaration. She stood before him and reached for his hand, folding her fingers into his. No one ever called me by my name and meant it, she whispered. You did. The first time, without knowing what it cost me to lose it. I just saw someone worth saying it to. The hum of the ship wrapped around them. He could feel her through the tether. What once was a fragile connection born of necessity had now become something unbreakable. Not just resonance, intimacy. The kind forged in hardship, shaped in quiet defiance, and sealed in the unspoken promise to never let the other be forgotten. She reached for the console and activated the main relay. Then let them all hear. Her voice, low and melodic, carried through the signal as she began to transmit. Not data, not words, but a sequence of harmonic pulses interlaced with meaning. A story. Her people's language. Her name. The translation software struggled. It garbled the symbols, twisted the syntax. But somewhere across the expanse of space, others would hear it, and they would know. She was not silent, and she was not alone. Weeks passed. News came slowly, carried by cargo haulers and whispered across research channels. A transmission had been intercepted on the outer rim, a song unlike anything in recorded galactic linguistics. Unidentified origin, unknown function. Some called it an anomaly, others called it an artifact. But one or two called it a voice. Ren and Kalia settled in a neutral zone on the edge of the Ressian Reach, where no law was too strict and no eye watched too close. A station built into a crumbling moon became their sanctuary. There, Ren taught students, translated old languages, and curated xenobiological archives. Kalia sang into the deep. She taught melodies that shaped light. She spoke through frequency. And slowly, visitors came. Not because of fame, but because they wanted to understand. One night, under the silver-blue glow of twin moons, Kalia returned from her walk across the station's outer ring and found Ren asleep in the observatory chair. He held a datapad in one hand, its screen dimmed, a half-written note still open. She curled beside him. Ren, she whispered. He stirred. When they sold me, she said, they marked me as broken, as nothing. I remember. They didn't see me. I did. He said without opening his eyes. I always will. She rested her head against his shoulder. You gave me my voice back. He smiled. No, you always had it. I just listened. She closed her eyes, letting the soft hum of the station settle around her. Beyond the windows, the stars pulsed in slow rhythm, distant and vast. But here in this quiet space between worlds, a voice once silenced had become a beacon. Not because she shouted, but because someone finally had answered.